Ronnie James Dio was the heavy metal vocalist and songwriter. Died Sunday, was posted on his official website and confirmed by a publicist.
Ronald James Dio spent decades building one of the most instantly recognizable voices in rock music, and by the time the world knew him as Ronnie James Dio, he had already survived one band breakup, reinvented a legendary group that everyone assumed was finished without its original singer, and turned a hand gesture from his grandmother into a symbol used at concerts on every continent. What almost nobody outside his inner circle knew was what he left behind when he died in 2010, or how long it would take his widow to even face it. Boxes of tape, half-finished songs, a storage locker she couldn't bring herself to open for years, and a decision, years later, that would split his own fan base and draw open criticism from one of the biggest metal magazines in the world. This is the story of what actually happened to Ronnie James Dio's legacy after he was gone, and why so much of it is still being sorted out today. Before any of the mythology, before the wizards and dragons and the operatic wail that would define an entire era of heavy metal, there was a 5-year-old boy performing trumpet in front of an audience in upstate New York. Ronald James Dio was born on July 10, 1942, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, but his family relocated to Cortland, New York while he was still a small child, and it was there that his father, an amateur musician himself, pushed him toward formal training. Trumpet came first, then French horn, and by all accounts young Ronnie took to performing with an ease that suggested this wasn't going to be a passing hobby. For a long stretch, though it looked like music might stay exactly that, a hobby, Ronnie enrolled at the University at Buffalo with an eye toward pharmacology, a path that would have made him a respectable, steadily employed professional rather than a globally touring rock star. It's one of the stranger footnotes of his biography that the man who would eventually sing about demons and rainbows in the dark once seemed headed for a life behind a pharmacy counter. Music won out by the late 1950s, and once it did, he never seriously looked back. The name change came around the same period, and the story behind it has circulated among fans for years because of how unlikely it sounds. Ronnie took the stage name Dio, the Italian word for God, but the direct inspiration wasn't a religious statement at all. It came from Johnny Dio, a real Italian-American organized crime figure active in that era, whose surname simply stuck in young Ronnie's head as a strong, memorable stage name. One of heavy metal's most mystical, larger-than-life performers effectively borrowed his identity from a mobster, not from scripture, and he never made much secret of it in later interviews. His earliest professional work sounds nothing like what fans would come to associate with him. Bands like Ronnie and the Redcaps played rockabilly and doo-wop on the small club circuit, the kind of gigs that barely covered gas money, let alone anything resembling stardom. It wasn't until he formed the band Elf in the late 1960s that his sound began drifting toward the heavier, more theatrical rock that would eventually define his career, and by the time a much bigger opportunity came calling in the mid-1970s, Ronnie had already logged close to 2 decades in unglamorous, low-budget bands. That grind mattered later. Musicians who spend that long fighting for an audience tend not to treat fame the way overnight successes do, and colleagues who worked with Ronnie throughout his career have often pointed to that early stretch as the reason he stayed so disciplined about his craft even after he had nothing left to prove. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that early trajectory was for someone who would eventually be remembered as one of the defining voices of heavy metal. Most performers of his stature in that genre came up through garage bands playing blues rock covers, not through supper club doo-wop groups and a brief flirtation with a pharmacy degree. Ronnie's musical education, the formal training on brass instruments as a child, gave him a level of vocal control and range that set him apart from a lot of his contemporaries, many of whom leaned on raw power rather than the kind of precise, almost operatic delivery Ronnie eventually became known for. That technical foundation is part of why his voice held up as well as it did decades into his touring career, long after many singers from the same era had lost significant range. In 1975, former Deep Purple guitarist Ritchie Blackmore recruited Ronnie to front a new project called Rainbow. On paper, the pairing looked unlikely. Blackmore's playing leaned heavily on classical structure and technical precision, while Ronnie brought a taste for fantasy and myth into his lyrics that had nothing to do with Blackmore's stylistic background. Somehow the combination worked, and Rainbow became one of the more distinctive acts in the early heavy metal landscape, built around Ronnie's operatic range and a run of albums, including Rainbow Rising and Long Live Rock and Roll, that leaned into wizards, dragons, and rainbows in the dark as a kind of lyrical signature. The partnership didn't end because of one explosive argument. It ended because Blackmore's musical instincts started pulling toward a more commercial, radio-friendly sound heading into the album that would become down to earth. And Ronnie's entire appeal was built around exactly the fantastical, mythic register that direction was moving away from. It was less a fight and more a slow mismatch between two people who had built something genuinely good together and then discovered they wanted different things from it going forward. By the time Down to Earth was released in 1979, Ronnie was already gone, replaced by a different vocalist, and for most musicians a quiet exit like that would be the end of a promising chapter with nothing much to follow. For Ronnie, it turned out to be the setup for the single biggest opportunity of his career. What made the Rainbow Years matter so much in hindsight wasn't just the music itself, but the creative template it gave Ronnie going forward. Every band he fronted for the rest of his life carried some version of the fantasy and myth lyrical world he first built out fully in Rainbow. Wizards, dark rainbows, castles, and morality plays dressed up as adventure stories. Blackmore may have eventually wanted to move away from that sound commercially, but the sound itself didn't go anywhere. It simply moved on to wherever Ronnie went next, and it turned out there was a much bigger stage waiting for exactly that kind of material. Later in 1979, Ronnie joined Black Sabbath as the replacement for Ozzy Osbourne, the band's founding frontman and one of the most identifiable voices in the history of rock music. At the time, almost nobody thought this could work. Ozzy wasn't just a singer in the band. To a huge portion of the fan base, he essentially was the band, and stepping into that role looked less like a career move and more like an assignment built to fail publicly. Instead, Ronnie helped engineer one of the more remarkable second acts in rock history. The albums Heaven and Hell in 1980 and Mob Rules in 1981 gave Black Sabbath a genuine creative resurgence, and both records are still regularly cited among the strongest work the band ever produced, Ozzy-era material included. Ronnie's taste for mythological, larger-than-life imagery, the same sensibility that had drifted out of step with where Rainbow was headed, turned out to be exactly what Sabbath needed at that specific moment in their history. It was also during this Sabbath period that Ronnie introduced the devil horns hand gesture that is now recognized at metal concerts worldwide. Ronnie said in interviews that he picked it up from his Italian grandmother, who used the gesture superstitiously to ward off the evil eye, and once he started flashing it during live shows, the gesture spread far beyond Sabbath's own audience, eventually becoming one of the most universally understood symbols in the entire genre, instantly recognizable regardless of language or nationality. Part of what made this reinvention so effective was that Ronnie didn't try to imitate Ozzy's style at all. He brought his own operatic, theatrical delivery straight from Rainbow into Sabbath's much heavier, doom-laden instrumentation, and rather than clashing, the combination gave guitarist Tony Iommi's riffs a grander, more cinematic frame than they'd had before. Critics and fans who were skeptical going and often ended up describing Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules as proof that Sabbath's sound was bigger than any single vocalist, a genuinely rare outcome for a band replacing its founding frontman this early in its history. Given how creatively successful this era was, it's fair to expect the lineup would have stuck together for years. It didn't. Beneath the surface of two career-defining albums, tension had been building over money, credit, and creative control, and it wouldn't stay contained for long. Ronnie's original exit from Black Sabbath in 1982 came down to a dispute over how a live album the band wanted to release was going to be mixed. Ronnie and drummer Vinny Appice felt their contributions weren't being represented fairly in the final mix, and rather than compromise, both of them walked. Ronnie went on to found his own band, simply named Dio, and released Holy Diver in 1983 to major solo success, proving he didn't need the Sabbath name to draw an audience. That wasn't the last attempt to make the Sabbath partnership work. In 1992, Ronnie reunited with the band for an album called Dehumanizer, but the same underlying tensions resurfaced almost immediately, and the reunion produced exactly one record before falling apart again. It did leave behind one odd piece of pop culture trivia. A song from those sessions, Time Machine, ended up placed on the soundtrack of the comedy film Wayne's World, giving Ronnie an unlikely footnote in mainstream comedy at the same time the band itself was quietly falling apart behind the scenes. A third attempt looked far more promising. In 2006, Ronnie reunited again with guitarist Tony Iommi, bassist Geezer Butler, and drummer Vinny Appice, this time touring under the name Heaven and Hell specifically to keep this lineup distinct from the Ozzy-fronted version of Sabbath and avoid confusion between the two camps. They recorded new material for a compilation called The Dio Years, and by 2009 released a full studio album, The Devil You Know, their first complete record of new songs together in decades. It was met with strong reviews from critics who hadn't necessarily expected a band this far into its history to still have something meaningful left to say. The Heaven and Hell touring cycle behind The Devil You Know was, by most accounts from people around the band, one of the most creatively satisfying stretches of Ronnie's later career. After decades of on and off tension with the same three musicians, this version of the partnership finally seemed to have found a working rhythm, built on mutual respect, rather than the old arguments over billing and mixing decisions that had derailed the earlier reunions. Reviewers who caught shows on that tour frequently noted that Ronnie, well into his 60s by that point, still sounded remarkably close to his recordings from decades earlier, a detail that made what happened next even harder for the people closest to him to process at the time. During the tour supporting The Devil You Know, something was clearly wrong with Ronnie, even though nobody around him, including Ronnie himself, understood exactly what yet. He was in real physical pain on some nights, reportedly doubled over backstage before still going out and performing full sets, while the people closest to him had no real sense of how serious it had actually become. He and Winnie had already consulted a specialist about ongoing digestive problems before this tour, and at the time a round of tests, including cardiac exams, came back clear, finding nothing that explained what he was experiencing. So the tour continued, all the way to what turned out to be his final concert, performed on August 29, 2009, in Atlantic City. Nobody in that room had any idea it would be the last time they would see him perform live. Just months after that final show, in November 2009, Ronnie was diagnosed with stomach cancer. The first public statement from his camp described it as an early-stage diagnosis, and treatment began immediately at the Mayo Clinic with genuine hope that he would eventually be back on stage. The reality turned out to be considerably harsher than that initial statement suggested. Bandmate Geezer Butler has said publicly that by the time doctors identified what was actually wrong, the cancer had already progressed to stage 4 and was inoperable. According to accounts from people close to the situation, doctors indicated that an earlier colonoscopy, even a year or two before the diagnosis, might have caught the disease while it was still treatable. Instead, months of misread symptoms layered on top of a touring schedule that never paused had used up time that nobody realized was running out. Ronnie subsequently moved to MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, undergoing aggressive chemotherapy while continuing to speak publicly and optimistically about beating the disease. In April 2010, he made his final public appearance in person, attending the Revolver Golden Gods Awards to accept the honor for Best Metal Singer. For fans watching at the time, that appearance genuinely sparked hope that he might pull through, since he looked and sounded closer to himself than anyone expected after months of aggressive treatment. He didn't recover. Ronnie James Dio died on May 16, 2010, at the age of 67, with close friends and family able to say private goodbyes beforehand. Wendy's public statement afterward described her heart as broken, while also emphasizing how deeply loved Ronnie had been by fans across the world. The gap between how the illness was first described publicly, an early-stage diagnosis with real hope of recovery, and how far it had actually progressed by the time doctors caught it, is one of the more sobering threads running through the whole final chapter of his life. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in stories of touring musicians. Physical symptoms explained away or pushed through because a tour has momentum, an audience is waiting, and stopping feels like letting people down. Whether earlier intervention would genuinely have changed the outcome is something nobody can answer with certainty, but the account from people close to Ronnie at the time suggests it at least would have changed the odds. That might have been where the public story ended. Instead, it was really only the beginning of a much messier and more complicated one, because deciding what to do with everything Ronnie had built turned out to take Wendy years to even approach, let alone resolve. After Ronnie's death, Wendy took full control of his legacy and continued running Niji Entertainment, the label and management company the two of them had built together. She has also had to repeatedly and publicly deny persistent internet rumors claiming the couple had secretly divorced before his death, insisting they remained together until the end. The material Ronnie left behind wasn't sitting in a single dramatic locked room, as some retellings of the story like to suggest. Wendy has described it, in interviews given years later, as a climate-controlled storage facility packed with recordings, notebooks, and tapes that she found overwhelming to face for a long time after his death. In one interview she gave roughly 7.5 years after he passed, she explained that she finally felt able to go through those materials without breaking down, something that simply hadn't been possible in the earlier years. What she found inside wasn't nothing, depending on which interview she gave, and when Wendy has described anywhere from 3 to several unfinished Dio songs. Tracks with completed lyrics and Ronnie's own vocals already recorded, backed by members of his band, but left unfinished in various stages, some barely sketched out and others much closer to done. Some of that material came from sessions with bassist Jimmy Bain before Bain's own death, and other pieces came from work with guitarist Craig Goldie that had simply been set aside and never revisited. Additional material reportedly dates back to sessions for Magica 2, an intended sequel to Dio's 2000 concept album Magica that was left unfinished when Ronnie died. One track from those sessions, Electra, was eventually released on a compilation in 2012, while guitarist Doug Aldrich has said more material from those same sessions could still surface. Wendy has been consistent on one point across nearly every interview on the subject. She is not interested in rushing any of it out simply because it carries Ronnie's name. She's described Ronnie as a perfectionist who wouldn't have wanted unfinished work released just to capitalize on his death. And she said she wants any future release vetted by people with the technical expertise, including longtime recording engineer Wyn Davis, to judge whether it actually meets the standard Ronnie held for everything else he put his name on. In her own words from more than one interview, she has said she isn't interested in flooding the market with material that doesn't live up to what Ronnie would have wanted attached to his name. That is a notably different approach than what happens with a lot of major artists after they die, where posthumous material gets hurried into stores within a year or two regardless of its actual state of completion. The music industry has no shortage of examples of unfinished vocal takes stitched together with new instrumentation and rushed out to capitalize on a wave of public grief, often to a mixed reception from longtime fans who can tell the difference between a completed vision and a patched-together approximation of one. Wendy's approach, deliberately slow and gated behind a professional listen from people who worked with Ronnie for years, has kept his archive largely intact rather than picked apart, even if it also means fans have had to wait far longer than they might have wanted for any of it. One of Wendy's first major moves after Ronnie's death was establishing the Ronnie James Dio Stand Up and Shout Cancer Fund, which has since raised well over $1 million for cancer research and public awareness through recurring fundraising events like Ride for Ronnie and Bowl for Ronnie, drawing in musicians and fans who never had a chance to say goodbye while he was still alive.